Comrades, I'd like to thank the chair for that an appreciative introduction, calling him one of the leading Marxist economists. They would probably only fill about 1/4 of this room anyway, so there's not much competition in that particular area, because as Terry Eagleton and people from the floor were saying in the previous session, economists, and academic economists in particular, are mostly right-wing and fully apologetic and supportive of the capitalist system and the market economy, for which they see no real problems, couldn't be solved by the lack of interference from governments or trade unions or any organised form of labour. Terry said in the previous introduction that Marx never wanted to talk about economics. His aim, of course, was to bring about a society where people had the time and freedom to develop their own abilities. But unfortunately, capitalism is all about economics. The drive to make money, to make profit, has pervaded every aspect of life, including cultural life and our personal lives and everything. So he was forced to, in the 1850s, when the revolutionary upsurge of 1848 had ended, and there didn't seem to be any other prospect of a move by the working class to change society, to try and analyse the nature of what he called capital. I don't think he ever used the word capitalism, what we commonly use now, but he looked at the question of capital. And he wanted to analyse what were the processes and laws behind the motions of this new mode of production, which was now dominating not just the advanced countries like Britain and France at that time, but later on America and Germany, and of course as we've gone into the 20th century, completely across the globe. And as we speak in 2014, 170 years since Engels wrote the book The Condition of the Working Class in England, about Manchester and about the first early days of industrial capitalism in Britain, now capitalism is all over the world, its global tentacles are everywhere, and the same conditions which relate to new people coming into the labour force in the industrial cities of China, of India, of Indonesia, of Latin America, are the same conditions faced by the British working class in the 1840s and subsequently. But also, as Terry pointed out in the earlier session, the huge expansion of production based on the profit-making economy and private ownership and the drive and competition between capitals to exploit as much as possible the labour power which we exert on behalf of making a living for ourselves. And so that is the introduction to this discussion, which I've called the nature of the current long depression. In your programme it says the long recession. I think that's going to be part of the issue that I want to debate, that we had a huge Great Recession, similar to, we haven't seen one since the 1930s like this, in 2008-9, globally for the first time. The 1930s Great Depression, which began with a stock market crash in 1929, and then a huge fall and contraction of output and living standards for mainly America and Europe, to some extent other parts of what is now called emerging Europe and Latin America, but nothing like the global extent that the Great Recession of 2008 has developed. And the purpose of this thing is to say what's been happening since. But in most definitions by economists, the Great Recession came to an end in the middle of 2009. Namely, things didn't keep on going down anymore after that point. And subsequently, we've had supposedly a recovery. It's my argument in this piece that the recovery has been so weak, so feeble, so lengthy in returning to where it was before. It's not been a return to normal, that we can describe this period as a long depression, similar to the Great Depression of the 1930s, and similar to an earlier depression of the 1880s, which took place in Britain, the United States, and parts of Europe. So, but these depressions and this Great Recession was not something expected and forecast by the academic economists that I've talked about, the apologists of capital, who say that capitalism is the best system of all possible worlds to make life work for us, and that not only has it been here always in some sort of way, it will always be here, and it's the only thing that's wrong with it is in occasional shocks and bounces that it gets that we have to deal with. And we can't really predict what those are. And the top US economist we call them neoclassical, us economics people, which means that basically the neoclassicals think that capitalism's got a perfect market economy, it's free of flow of labour and capital, everybody competes on the market equally, and that produces an equilibrium, steady growth in an economy. Well, one of the top economists in the University of Chicago, Robert Lucas, who has a Nobel Prize, which, by the way, when you win a Nobel Prize, is quite a lot of money, he said that back before this, about 2002, he said the central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes. This is just 5 years before the crash. Eugene Farmer, another Nobel Prize winner from the same university, who also won the prize for saying that markets are so efficient that they make everything work perfectly, and when they don't, well, it's just they don't. We don't know what causes recession, says Eugene. I'm not a macroeconomist, so I don't feel bad about that. We've never known. Debates go on to this day what caused the Great Depression. Economics is not very good at explaining swings in economic activity. If I could have predicted the crisis, I would have. I don't see it. I'd love to know more what causes business cycles. Nobel Prize winner. Ben Bernanke, who was recently the charge of the whole US monetary policy at the Federal Reserve Bank, he's been replaced by Janet Yellen now, said, I think the recent global crisis is best understood as a classic financial panic transposed into a novel institutional context of the 21st century financial system. What that means is he thinks it was just a financial shock, a crash. We know the banks crashed. And that's all we really have to say about it. These things happen, is the conclusion of these leading macroeconomists. Now, there is an alternative view, which is expressed in the 30s by the British economist John Maynard Keynes, the University of Cambridge. His became an alternative presented in the economics profession to what causes depressions or recessions. And you might sum it up in this quote I have from his current epigony, person who follows Keynes to the letter, Paul Krugman, another pro-Nobel Prize winner, who is now writes a regular blog in the New York Times every day, telling us basically that if we'd only adopt Keynesian economics, all the problems would be solved. And he says that depressions are essentially a technical malfunction. It's a bit like a car with a magneto problem. It's a bit of an electric problem. If we just get inside the car, fix that, or if you've got a bad tooth, you fix your tooth, get it out, put some medication in, and then everything will flow forward. It's a small but critical problem in an electrical system, and the job of an economist is to figure out how to repair that little technical problem. And that is the view of the leading Keynesian at the moment. Now, there are more radical views about what happened in the Great Recession and the financial crash. Back in the 1980s and 90s, a follower of Keynes called Hyman Minsky, who was more radical. He said, well, actually, it's not quite just as simple as that. There's clearly something essentially unstable about banks and financial institutions. They're always engaged in increasing debt and giving debt to people and creating a situation where debt is too much, there's too much speculation about making more money, and then it comes crashing down. So the fraud exists because the financial system, for necessary capitalist vitality and vigour, translate into animal spirits to give effective demand. But it contains the potential for a runaway expansion powered by an investment boom, like if you like, what's that cartoon, the image of that chasing across over the cliff, and then it's hanging there and suddenly crashes down. That's the image that Minsky paints about economy. When it looks stable, that's when it's unstable. And it's unstable because of the financial sector. It's nothing to do with the fact that there's a production process involved in making money, employing people, employing capital to invest, to build factories, build offices, provide new services. That's absolutely fine. It's when those rotten bankers get into the system and make people speculate and think they can make more money than there really is. So this Minsky view continues. We can see that modern view is by Steve Keen, who's a radical economist, just been sacked in the University of Sydney in Australia, and has now become the head of the economics department at Kingston University in London. He says that capitalism is inherently flawed, being prone to booms, crises and depressions. This instability, in my view, is due to characteristics that the financial system must possess if it is to be consistent with full-blown capitalism. So again, this view, this radical view, is it's all due to the financial sector. Now, what's the other big thing that everybody goes on about now? It's inequality. You've just had a session on this. What a lot of economists are saying now is why we had a crash is that there's been a huge rise in inequality. And when inequality gets too big, then you get a crash. Then you get an economy that comes crashing down. And there's no doubt about the evidence, as Thomas Piketty has put out, but others like Emmanuel Saez and Zuckman, I won't give you all these economists, but they've been slaving away over the data. And you can see, if you look, this is the inequality of income. This is the amount of wealth per head of income. And you can see there's a rise, and that inequality is continually rising in all the major economies of the world, particularly since the 1980s. This is the very latest data, it only came out 2 weeks ago, which shows the top 0.1% of wealth holders in the United States now have just under 25% of all the wealth. Now, we're not talking income here, we're talking what you own, whether it's your home, your stocks and shares, which of course you all have here, and your cash deposits in the bank, savings you can't think of anything to spend with, you know, those sort of things. And probably the most important one, which will affect most people, is the pension, which will be supposedly a deferred wage that you've been building up to live on when you no longer get a wage. Well, you know, that's your wealth. For most of the top 0.1%, it's not their home, even if they're living in a huge mansion like Griff Rhys-Jones or something. It's not their home, it's not their cash in the bank particularly, it's not even their pensions. It's the ownership of huge amounts of bonds and stocks and shares or companies that they own. And that's the major part of their wealth. And that part, for this top 0.1%, which is very, very, very tiny, we talk about the 1%, this is the real capitalist class, the 0.1%. You'd be surprised how many in this room might even qualify in the top 20%. You'd be surprised, because the inequality of income and wealth is like this. It's not, it's just goes straight up. It's the extremes of wealth means that this 0.1% have a huge amount of the wealth. And that's just in the US. Recent figures show that the United Nations University and Credit Suisse, a big European investment bank, does a regular survey, and they found the latest position is that the top 1% of wealth holders in the whole world own nearly 50% of all the personal wealth in the whole world. That shows how extreme the inequality is. This keeps rising. So the top of the apex there, 98,000. There's 98,000 people in the whole world, adults. 4.5 billion adults, or households, I don't know how many households, probably 3.5 billion households. 98,000 of them own 48% of everything. And this is the level of inequality which exists in I mean, it's a staggering fact, but there it is. Now the question is, some economists say, that this is what causes the crisis. That because the people like us have not had proper wage increases and so on for 20 or 30 years, they've been borrowing more to get their houses, mortgages, and all the rest of it. The debt is rocketed up, and because of that, the debt has reached a point where people can't even service it, and that's what happened. There was a crash because of the rising inequality and the rising debt. So, says this particular group of economists, who wrote a book called House of Debt, which is the second best-selling book after Mr. Piketty's Marxist Economics this year, says that recessions are not inevitable. They are not mysterious acts of nature that we must accept. And I think that's a very important point. Plus, is they're the product of a financial system that fosters too much household debt. Excessive reliance on debt is our culprit. Because it's just household debt, we can fix it, they say. We don't need to view severe recessions and mass unemployment as an inevitable part of the business cycle. We can determine our own fate. That almost sounds like it might be Marxist, but it isn't. What it means is that simply if we could just control the amount of household debt there is in the world, or in the major economies, then we won't have a big crash that we had last time. So there is a growing view amongst even left economists, and Engelbert Stockhammer is a left economist. He's unheard of amongst mainstream economists, but amongst us lefties in this small room, he almost gets in the door. Engelbert Engelbert says that rising inequality is not just horrible, not just shocking, but it is the cause of the crisis. The avoidance of crisis, similar to the recent one, and the generation of stable growth regimes involves a simultaneous consideration of income and wealth distribution, financial regulation, and aggregate demand. Complicated phrases, but basically he's saying if we have the right equality between wages and profits, not too much wages, not too much profits, but just about right, as we had apparently briefly in the 1950s and 1960s, then we can have a stable capitalist economy, because we're not going to change anything about the way the actual mode of production takes place. It's merely a question of getting that distribution right. So it's a question of distribution, it's a question of debt, it's a question of instability amongst the banks. These are the more radical theories. Remember, back at the beginning, the mainstream theory is there is no crisis. We never saw it, it didn't happen, and we have no explanation for it, carry on. Now this is the more radical view expressed here. Well, is inequality the cause of the crisis? No, it's not, in my view, and certainly in other views of others. There's a couple of Marxist economists who would get in the room, but they speak French. Dublin and Levy say that the concentration of income distribution has not really been the cause, because if you've got low wages, the argument goes, and there's not enough and they're not rising, and there's more profits rising compared to wages, then workers won't spend enough money, there'll be a lack of consumption, and that's what causes the crisis. It's a lack of consumption which causes the crisis. This links up to what Keynes said. It's the cause of a lack of demand, mainly because workers don't have enough money to buy the goods that are being produced. This is the line that comes across. Well, Dumas and Levy say that there is no sign that there's been any particular decline in consumption. Between 1980 and 2006, actually spending gained 10 percentage points in share of the total production. So people were spending more, probably because they were raising more debt to do so, but they were spending more. So there wasn't a lack of demand or lack of consumption. Yes, it might be due also to debt, but these mainstream economists say that there's no evidence to say there's anything to connection between rising inequality and booms of credit, as the previous economist, the second best book, said. That when they look at the data and they analyse it, they don't see a crisis comes about either because there's a rising inequality, when they look at previous crashes, or through rising debt. So there's some doubt whether this theory empirically holds together. But this is the dominant theory, I'll remind you again. If you want to read the radical view, I mean, the mainstream view is there is no crisis. The radical view is to do with rising inequality and rising debt. Nothing to do with the capitalist mode of production. That's fine and dandy. It's just that we've had these problems in the banks. Too much debt, they've been lending us too much, and the wages haven't been rising enough for some unknown reason. And then we have to give more wages, or we have to stop the debt rise. Has consumption declined? This is the argument that would follow. The crisis is due to the lack of ability to buy enough goods for the workers. Well, this is the position in the US. Consumer spending and Labour's share of what's being produced. So the capitalist employs you, he produces $100 worth of goods or services. How much do you get? Well, you get 54% of the total production in the capitalist economy in the US now, falling from something like 60% shared amongst everybody, if you like, within the actual companies themselves. But that hasn't led to a sharp drop in consumer spending, mainly because of debt, but it's rocketed up. Actually, consumer spending in the US has never been higher, leading up to the point of the crisis. So, lack of consumer spending can't be the problem. And where there's no discussion in any of these arguments about the profit-making economy. Because this, what Marx is talking about, what Terry was talking about before, Marx said, look, this is the fundamental contradiction in this mode of production, that what people need can only be produced if a small group of people who own the means of production and employ the rest of us make a profit out of what they invested. That's the way the system works. Competing against each other to get more profit than the other person, or to sustain their profit in competition. So the two great battles or contradictions under capitalism are, one, exploiting enough out of the workers and keeping it from them getting it, raising their profits in relation to the labour as a class, and competing against other capitals, and to make sure that you maintain your market share and your profitability. Those two battles, nothing has been raised either by the mainstream economists who deny that profit really anything to do with anything, or the Keynesians, or even the most radical people. It's only effective demand, lack of consumption, it's income, it's some theory of crisis based on spending and nothing to do with profit at all. Now, Marx wouldn't agree. One of the phrases that we always like to pull out, those of us who take the argument about profitability, is that the most important law of political economy is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. The simple formula is pretty simple, is that S, which is the amount that capitalists extract out of us in terms of profit, has to be weighed against how much they have to invest. They invest in machines, technology, other raw materials, which is C, and how much they have to give us in wages, which is V. And Marx said over a period of time, the most important law of the capitalist mode of production is that profitability overall in an economy begins to decline. And once it begins to decline, that creates problems for capitalists competing against each other and creates the conditions for a crisis or a slump. The law is spelt out very quickly. The law says, as capitalism develops, employs more labour, it has to compete against other capitals, so it wants to not just take us up to working 24 hours a day, which you can't do, or even 16 hours a day, or using child labour, or employing female labour, or expanding throughout the world to use every bit of peasant labour it can find. It's continuing to do that. It also has to try and raise how much each worker that they're employing produces. They can get the productivity of that worker up and the best way, that's the nature of that mode of production. Introduce new machines, new technology that continually can raise the rate of profit, rate of productivity that workers can provide. But in so doing, it has to spend more and more on machinery. And Marx said that realistically, the ratio of how much they spend on this machinery and technology will rise faster than relatively to how much labour they're going to use. In fact, they'll get rid of labour. They can replace workers with robots, with bigger machines. So that you can continually create a surplus labour force that you can use again to exploit. But that increased technology becomes more and more expensive, and relative to the overall investment, there is a tendency for the profit to fall. Profit is still going up, but relative to what you're having to spend to get it to go up in competition, it starts to fall. There are counteracting factors. You can squeeze the workers more. So if you can't get enough profit out of a British worker or an Irish worker, you can go to China, you can go to Latin America, and you can get them for much cheaper. So that's an important way of raising the rate of surplus value. You can, if your machine that you introduce is so much cheaper, take the internet where you have computers, you had a big computer 30 years ago, now you've got this with the same power and possibly cheaper, and therefore your cost is reduced. Or if one country can exploit another country more effectively through foreign trade, through imperialism. And also, you can get some fictitious profits. You can fake some profits, as the banks do, by gaining, you see big increases in profits. It's really being taken away from the rest of the economy, but it also provides, for a period of time, some counteracting factor to profitability. But the final line is this. Marx says, this is his argument, it has to be empirically verified, it might be wrong, but his main conclusion on looking at a profit-making economy, a capitalist economy, is that the tendency for the rate of profit to fall will override, over time, those counter-tendencies. It doesn't always happen. In fact, I will show that it takes sometimes a decade or two before that tendency begins to exert itself. And in fact, you're getting a cyclical process of when the counter-tendency is in control and the tendency is not in control. Now, Business Book of the Year, Thomas Piketty, talked about inequality, but he also refers specifically to Marx's law in his book, and he says, the rate of return on capital, which is the rate of profit if you like, is a central concept in many economic theories. In particular, Marxist analysis emphasises the falling rate of profit, an historical prediction that has turned out to be quite wrong. So, according to Piketty, the rate of profit hasn't fallen, whether it's in the US or anywhere of any importance. It's not a theory which relates to anything going on in a capitalist economy. Well, this is the work of an Argentine Marxist economist. He would get in the room. I'll hang up here somewhere. Young lad, probably no young probably as young as this guy. He's making progress. He looked at 14 countries since 1869 and worked out the rate of profit and made a world rate of profit. Now, what do you notice about this? Well, first of all, the rate of profit falls over time, secularly, if you like, if you look at it long term, but not in a straight line. Not in a straight line. So sometimes the counteracting factors are much more powerful and the rate of profit rises. So I've broken it up the way I like it. And what you've got here in the early period, after the 1870s, you have the first long depression. Very sharp fall in the rate of profit for the major economies. We're talking mainly Europe there and the United States. And then from about the mid-1890s onwards, you get a recovery leading towards the war. Imperialist war, profit rises significantly. Destruction of capital, exploitation of labour, because everybody goes to the war effort. Rate of surplus value rises, the rate of profit is high. Then we have a period after 1924, after the roaring 20s as they were called in the United States, when you enter this crash, this unbelievable crash in the Great Depression, which destroys lots of companies, people's work, people are laid off, companies are closed down, old technology is thrown away. That it raises the rate of profit. That's the way the rate of profit is restored through this huge slump in things that were used before. They were just written off. And the new capitalists come in, or the old capitalists take over the new, and they can do so at a cheaper rate with lots of workers on the dole prepared to take a very low wage. That continues into the war. The war, profit rate in the war rises dramatically because workers are working long hours, they're maybe getting wages. In fact, wages rose during the war in Britain and the United States, but people didn't spend that on themselves. They were asked to put it into war bonds, and it was hell for them in order to the war effort. So it actually went into the profitability of the companies who continued to sell to the state tanks, machinery for military equipment and so on, the rest of it. But they made a profit. They didn't do it for the war effort. They did it for a profit. As we know, they even sold to the Germans for a while while the war was going on, the Americans, and vice versa. So profit rate rises very high. After the war, there's a bit of a slump as people get back to civilian work. And then we have what is called the Golden Age. This is the baby boomer start for me. And you see a rise in the rate of profit, actually a strengthening of the labour movement. The labour movement becomes stronger in this period. The rate of profit's up, people are getting better wages, capitalism can afford to pay them. But at a certain point, from about the mid to late 60s, they can no longer start to fall because Marx's law is beginning to exert itself and the rate of profit is coming down. And see how fast it comes down in that period between the mid-60s and the early 1980s. Very fast. This is a serious crisis for capitalism, as bad in many ways as the Great Depression, the profitability crisis of the 70s, the late 60s and 70s, when there was also a major struggles with the labour movement, which was strong. And when I was young, that was what I was engaged in. That was the crisis period, I remember that. I remember the period of getting a decent education in the Golden Age and having all the facilities of a free university education, which of course doesn't exist anymore. Golden Age is really a golden age in many ways. And then you have the crisis and the struggle. But then we have the neoliberal recovery. So we have Thatcherism, we have Reaganism, we have a big recession in 1982, which lays off loads of workers, destroys the manufacturing sector in many of the old economies, and allows the rate of profit to rise. But just think of the neoliberal recovery. It's not much, is it? It's pretty feeble. This is 14 countries. 14 countries, so it's not just the US. And you can see it's not that great, is it? It's not exactly turning things around compared to where they were even in the golden, certainly in the Golden Age, and anything like that. So the recovery has been poor. And then from the the end of the 1990s, on a global scale, we start to go down again. And that is my argument, that underlying this process of the Great Recession is that we entered a new period of profitability difficulty, a real problem. They're trying to keep that up. You can see this. There's been a big effort to drive that profit rate up between 2002 and 2007, mainly in the financial sector, with the huge banking things and all those scandals that we now know about. But then we have the Great Recession, which slumps down. This goes up to about 2009. So that's gives you a wide world picture on the basis of Marx's law, contrary to Thomas Piketty. If we take it a little closer, just look at this period since the post-war, we see the crisis of the 70s begins in the mid-70s, comes right down, then we have that neoliberal recovery, and then, in my view, from the end of the 1990s, which I put forward that view in 2005, Comrade Maito has confirmed my view, so he's obviously right, that a new crisis begins from the late 1990s. And that's the period that we're in now. So the long depression is a product, includes, the depressions that we see before includes several recessions, not just one after the other. And that there are in a period of a down wave of the profitability. World rate of profit, that was my own work, which before Mr. Maito, basically says, there you go, up from the neoliberal period, and then a sort of consolidation or fall in parts of the top countries, the G7, you'll see a slide. But the emerging economies kept the profit rate up a bit higher. What we call the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, they kept the rate up for a period of time a bit longer. Maybe I'll skip this, but basically this is to explain why the rate of profit's fallen. But if you look at the red line, in the neoliberal period, the organic composition of capital fell. So that's contrary to what Marx says would happen on a general case. They had a fall in the cost of machinery and raw materials relative to labour. So the organic composition fell. And it's the opposite of what would be the general rule. The counteracting factor is playing, therefore the rate of profit should rise, which it did. The other factor is, did the share of profit or the rate of surplus value increase? Well, the green line, it did sort of increase during the neoliberal period, and to continue to increase, it's reached an all-time high. But what's happened since the 1990s is the organic composition, the red line has started to rise, so the rate of profit has stopped rising. But we can leave that one if you like. And the same thing applies to the Great Depression. I looked at the Great Depression, the reasons for the rate of profit falling, which they did from 1924 onward, is because of a change in the organic composition of capital and so on. So that would, you see, I like laws which you can make predictions about. I think science is not just about saying this is what happened, it's also saying trying to say what's going to happen. When Einstein worked out the theory of relativity, and he said that it bends space and time, he predicted that at some point it will bend space and time and we'll be able to see it. So they did an experiment with the eclipse of the sun and the moon, and an astronomer found out there was an infinitesimal bending of space and time, thus proving the law. The prediction was correct. Now, this is what prediction. There's never been such a coincidence of cycles since 1991. It's all at the bottom of the hill. In 2010, there will be a very severe economic slump of a degree not seen since 1982 or more. That was said in 2005 by yours truly. So that means I'm on the rumour moan now, isn't it? Quickly now, I said about 5 minutes already, about 10 minutes through. But I want to show that the cycle here, you can move from a falling rate of profit, then the overall mass of profit falls, that's the orange bit on the right, you have a collapse in investment, that brings about a collapse in consumption and employment, and then you get a financial collapse, the blue bit, in the bank. So it's contrary to the Keynesians and the others. They say it goes this way, it goes from the blue to the green and back that way. Actually, the Marxist view is it goes from the rate of profit to the mass of profit to the investment to the consumption to the financial collapse. And after the collapse, then you get the profit rises, the rate of profit comes up, accumulation growth, and then the law applies again and we go around in a cycle. So you have cycles of boom and slump using the law there. And in the recent period, we can see that the profit, I'll skip these, but basically the profit here in the US starts falling in 2006, and then investment and production falls in the US in the Great Recession. Then at the beginning of 2009, profits start rising and have been rising since, and there's a recovery in the economy. So in my view, now, as you can see with that very low rate of profit at the end of that previous graph, we're in a long depression, similar to the Great Depression of the 1930s and the 1880s. And Marshak, another Marxist economist who would make the room, agrees with that, so that's why he would. Let me just give you a schematic example. of the difference. This is perhaps a bit technical, but basically the argument is this. Most economists think we have recession, so we have one in 1974, you go down, then you come up, and you start off again. Then 1982 was double dip, they call it, it happened twice, so you get a W. And then depression would look like that on the right-hand side. It would come down, but it would come back, but it would never get back to the previous growth level. It would take forever. In late 19th century, that's exactly how it looked, growth-wise. And then if we take the Great Depression, that's how it looked. And what you notice is that war was the only thing that drove the thing back up again. This is where we are now as of 2012. They've slightly turned up a bit since then. But again, I think that's why it's a depression. This is out in Brisbane at the moment. The G20 is meeting. That's the top 20 leaders are meeting in the world economy. They're discussing Ukraine and saying Mr. Putin's a bastard. They're discussing climate change and have got the Chinese to agree to control emissions while they think about controlling theirs. And then they discuss growth, which is not looking good. And you can see this is the latest figures from that G20 meeting provided by the OECD. And you can see they call it stuck in low gear. It's not got back to where it was before. It's trending below. You might say, oh, that's a small trend. It used to be 4% a year, the dotted line. Now it's just a 2.5. Well, so what? It's pretty close, isn't it? Yeah, but you think about it. Over 20 years, the difference between 4% a year and 2.5% a year is a lot. You think about it in terms of your own wages. If somebody says to you, we'll pay you 4% a year for the next 5 years, well, no. We're only going to pay you 2.5% a year for the next 5 years, which is precisely what's happened. Only worse, you've been paid nothing for the last 5 years while prices have risen. And that really begins to affect your level of income. Investment has disappeared. And why is that? Well, I've got figures for Europe here. Since the end of the recession, 2009, there's been a bit of a recovery, but nowhere near back to the level of 100 for most economies. You notice the only one which is back to 100? Could that be this lovely isle? Has restored its rate of profit to where it was in 2005, as of 2012. But that's, that was 7 years. Even there, the rest haven't even got there. Italy's going nowhere. Where's Italy going? Italy's going south. Literally. UK too. UK's supposed to be booming. Well, profitability-wise, it's still well below where it was prior to the end of the start of the Great Recession. It's still struggling, and so is investment. Business investment. Sure, there's always housing, but there's not business investment taking place. The debt remains dramatically high. It's still not come down. That's the level of private sector debt in the US. It rocketed up to keep the economy going, keep consumption going. How much have they managed to get rid of in this Great Recession? Not very much. The housing bubble, which was usually regarded as part of the triggering the crisis in the US, is back in line. But debt in the companies, which rocketed up from the 1980s, and then they got rid of some of it just because it was written off, they didn't pay it, but it's still more or less very high. So there's still a lot of debt, low profitability, a lot of debt. And you can see on the left-hand scale, if you look at the US, Euro, and Japan, the level of total debt in these economies, 2007, 2013, it's not lower, it's higher. So there's still more burden upon the capitalist system, which eats into profit. And that means that nobody wants to borrow any money. Well, if you've got a lot of debt, you don't want to borrow any money, and if the banks don't want to lend you any because you've got too much debt. So the result is that bank lending has dropped away and still not recovered. So the investment, apart from the US, has not returned. At the end of last year, this is the level of business investment in the major economies. The UK is still way down there. Eurozone, excluding Germany, is way down there. Germany and the US have done better, and Japan have done better. So let me finish on this. Well, I'm going to finish now. What we've seen here is, I argue that the rate of profit does provide us an indicator of what's going on. It gives an indicator when how the crisis come about, and when they're going to come about to some extent. That capitalism is now in a long depression where it's struggling to get profitability up, struggling to get debt down, and struggling to get investment up in order to restore the level of growth that it previously had, and it can't get there. It's not doing it. It's this a depressive period. Will this go on forever? Well, Marx said there's no permanent crisis. If you can destroy enough of the old machinery and technology that's no use, get rid of the zombie companies that are blocking the new companies to come forward, if you lay off enough labour and you can restore profitability, and then accumulation can resume. We've already got massive unemployment rates, admittedly coming down in a lot of countries now, after the Great Recession, but apparently that's not enough. We've still got lots of companies who can't earn enough to pay just enough service their debts, but they can't get it down or have enough to expand. And those companies that have got a lot of money, hoarding cash, the Apples and the Amazons of this world, prefer to speculate in the stock market or buy their own shares rather than invest, because they can't see that the overall profitability is going to be there for that. So the process of a further destruction of capital is necessary before the whole thing can start again. And is war out of the way out? Well, in the 1930s, a war appeared to be the solution. That's a physical destruction of capital. I don't think that's going to happen this time. We have Cold Wars and all that, but we're not going to have a world war, in my view, between the major economies anymore. It's going to be more like the 19th century long depression, where competition and rivalry will build up, but it won't be the solution to the depression. And the long depression of the 19th century, late 19th century, did come to an end before a war, and then in a boom period it led to an imperialist battle. So in my view, once we come through the war, it will require probably another huge recession, or possibly more, before we can begin to see capitalism come out of this crisis. Of course, the best way for it to come out of this crisis is to replace it altogether, to abolish it. But let's assume for the moment that the working class does not manage to achieve that, either in a major capitalist economy or a series of them in this period. So it can do. Capitalism will not just stay indefinitely in a mess. It will try to come out of this struggle. But it continues to engender poverty, inequality, crises, yet again, and now we have the increasing problem of global warming, which is beginning to destroy the nature of the planet. Environmental disasters and extreme weather are increasing very exponentially at the moment. And until we replace the mode of production, based on ownership in common and a democratic control plan for the world, then the whole crap will go over again. Okay, Mary?
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question. Why don't you think there's going to be a war? Do you think that it would be too destructive for the nations that would get involved in it because of the advent of the atom bomb? Or do you think that they just don't need it yet? And secondly, if the rate of profit continues to fall, how far can it actually go? Is it... I can't see the graph very well, so I can't understand.
15%, that one.
Yeah. Does the rate of profit continue to fall from the very start of capitalism all the way to now, or is it?
No, good question.
Does it continue to? Does it go up and down, but generally stay the same? And also, do we know what the rate of, or is there a possibility, or is it even meaningful to calculate a rate of profit for a pre-capitalist society? And how would that? Back in the room.
Some Marxist economists have been observing shortening of the cumulative cycles in the last years, and I want to know if you agree with that observations, and what does it mean to? Does it have some connection with the current crisis, and what does it mean for the future of capitalism?
Kondratiev cycles.
Oh, right. Anybody else now? You have the front?
Yeah, 2 points. With the so-called, as you say, radical, not really martyr, the radical ones admit that with the exploited workers in China, would they admit that we can't not have a boom-bust economy with them? And secondly, what would the mainstream economists say about climate change and stuff? Would they admit we need to put capital into that?
Excellent questions. Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, just one point on. I thought it was interesting to see the graph on profitability, and that one of the countries that had recovered profitability is Ireland.
Yeah.
And obviously we know kind of when they're talking about recovery, as the government are talking about recovery now, what they really mean is that it's a recovery for them, because that's precisely what is happening. That what they've managed to do is they managed to have 6 years of austerity where they've hammered workers terms and conditions, and particularly workers' wages, and by doing that they have recovered some profitability. However, obviously that is problematic when the profitability recovery is only happening in one country, and so it's not something that they can just continue doing and just increasing profitability, because it's not possible really to do that in one country. But I just thought that's very interesting, and we should remember why that's happened and who that recovery is happening for, and obviously because it's profits, it's not a recovery for.
Good point, man.
I want to make a point about how Michael's argument about the declining rate of profit and Marx's argument about the declining rate of profit relates to something very fundamental about Marxism. Marx's great insight into history, which differentiated himself from all the views of history that came before, was that it's how you organise production that is at the heart of any society. Before Marx, the dominant view was that what determined history was what generals did, or kings, or emperors, or politicians, and then another view was that it's the ideas in people's head that drive things. Marx said no, at the basis of any society is how you produce the necessities of life. And then what the theory of the declining rate of profit says is that the crisis of capitalism is rooted in the way in which capitalism organises production. Right? It organises production for profit, with different corporations and different nation states all competing against one another, and with different groups of capitalists competing as to how much they can exploit their workers. And if you base, like Marx is saying, inevitably such a system wrecks human lives, wrecks the planet, and goes into crises and so on. And so this is absolutely to do with that. And it's important because the mainstream, so-called, and the mainstream economists and the mainstream, they will all the time talk about problems here and there, but they will never conceive there's anything wrong with the way production is fundamentally organised. That is the holy of holies that they project. They, bankers made mistakes, politicians made mistakes, we did this, but you can't organise production in any different way, and that's whereas socialists are saying that's what you have to change. So it's very fundamental.
Thank you, John. Pader at the front.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking of in terms of the market is when companies are producing things for profit, what they're looking for is exchange value rather than use value. And without being abstract about it, that just means that you don't really care whether what you're producing is useful or not. You just care whether you can exchange it and make a profit out of it. And that really, recessions really to me is like where they really can't, they're ceasing to make anything at all. But it begs a question that is it the case that in a recession people become increasingly desperate then, like that our standards fall, that we will agree or tend to agree with employers or the ruling class when they say, well look, make this thing, it'll make profit, there will be jobs. And you hear this argument. And I think Irish Water recently is a good example of how people don't fall for that necessarily. We are in a recession, people are fairly desperate for jobs, and yet this proposal is put to us, yes, but we can buy and sell water, and we could privatise it, and we can get a company in and we could run it for profit. And yet, as we've all noticed, the government is more and more pulling away from that, or trying to actually hide the fact that that was indeed the plan. And I think it's a very good example of how just because there's a recession doesn't mean people necessarily fall for the fact that profit for any reason is a good thing. And I think, like Michael was pointing out, it is extraordinary to the extent that they don't even want to talk about profit at all. This is not a system that's confident about its own brilliance, as they often try to impress us. This is this is the best of all possible systems. A market system works well. If it did, you'd think they'd be proud of all parts of it. and they'd be able to confidently stand up and say, we should get things for profit. It is why I finish on this. I think it's interesting that not alone do Marxists who join kind of broader political campaigns like People Before Profit not hide the notion that we're interested in the centrality of profit as a destructive influence, but it's one of the most popular slogans we have, people before profit.
Thank you, Paddy. Rory at the back of the room there.
Yeah, just a question. One of the things that Marxists look at historically in terms of different forms of class societies is, like capitalism or feudalism or any of the different modes of production that come before. Is that when a society reaches the point where it's no longer able to expand, productive forces, don't get too jargonistic, but our ability to produce things, produce wealth, and when a system is no longer able to expand that, we face the point where society can either make a change or slide backwards, and this is where modes of production meet their demise. And just looking at the data you had in your presentation there in terms of the world rate of profit, and the level it's at now seems to be at its very lowest ebb in the history of modern capitalism, and just like it's sort of in a very like a world historic sense, like what implications does that have for like the historic and long-term health of capitalist mode of production?
Okay, great stuff, Rory. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks very much. It was very useful. I think seeing the visuals is very useful. It gives people a sense, because they are quite difficult categories and the problem everyone always faces is trying to explain something very complex in a very quick space of time. It can be difficult, and I always struggled, and I was trained as an economist, and this is just a personal reflection, then two questions. I always found it very difficult to get beyond what Marx calls technically fetishism, because it does appear that machines are creating profits. After all, capitalists are the only ones who have machines, and they're the only ones who have profits. So in a certain sense you say to yourself, well look, this guy owns all these buildings, machinery, factories, and they seem to get profits from that. And of course, if anyone's ever worked in a factory, you know that the machinery is very productive. It produces a lot of things. And so one way that I try to think about it in terms of what we're arguing is actually behind those things is humans making them. And so imagine a situation where you put a so-called capitalist with all of his machines and technology on a desert island and see what happens next. But it's a good thought experiment, because think of it this way. If you put a human being on an island with 5,000 other human beings and call them a capitalist and told them to start making machines, you could see very quickly where the energy is. Humans can make machines. Machines on their own are just dead. But within our system it's hard to see that, because everything works together. In other words, there is no well, there's a few factories now that just have just machines, but you get my point. In most factories, it's workers and machines, and it's very easy to believe as an individual that when you walk in the door as a first employee, you're confronted with all these machinery. You think, oh, that's where all the money, that's the profit coming at me. But what Marx is able to see is behind all that, it's human beings and it's social relationships, and that's the kind of the drive that we're looking at. And so the only way for the system to actually survive is to suck more and more human beings into that relationship of capital. And that's the thing. So that's one thing. That's my contribution to make it maybe a bit more clear, hopefully. The questions then, Michael, would be where in the analysis you're saying broadly you think it may move out because of a new technological base. In other words, the whole thing can restart again on a new technological base. The question would be things like concentration of capital. So you're saying it's very difficult for them to deleverage. They haven't done it yet, but I would say presumably that's because capital now is so interconnected that it's very difficult to disentangle the parts that they could do without from the parts that that are essential. As we saw with Lehman Brothers, it's very hard for them to say, okay, we'll have a forensic analysis, get rid of some and keep some, because it all seems to be hanging together. So that would be one thing. And then the other thing would be, how would your graphs have no, they exclude China, obviously because the data is so difficult to get on China, but when you have hundreds of millions of new human beings sucked into the relationship of capitalism and lots of other humans who could be brought in, is that a way to, could we think about that in terms of the analysis as well? Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Comments? Anything else?
So just want to ask something small, just really about how do you factor in planned obsolescence into you know, one of the tools, planned obsolescence, you know, the way your mobile phone only lasts a year and a half and becomes a brick. You know, this is like one of the tools to try and kind of encourage consumption, because the notion of consumption has just really taken off as one of the explanations for why capitalism works. So I don't know if that's something, especially since the 1920s, 30s, as a factor of production.
Very good question, Paul. Thank you. Any other questions? Becca Bohr, Brian Richardson, Jesus Castillo and Marta Castillo. So the Spanish lesson came in handy after all. So I'm just going to bring Michael back to answer some of your questions.
Lots of questions, comrades. It's difficult to answer them all, as always the case, but I'm trying to sum up on these points. I'd like to start with the productive forces question, because that's very important, because, and it relates to this graph as well. That, as a comrade at the back said, the point that Marx made and Terry was making in the earlier session is that the key thing that Marx said was that capitalism was just one mode of production. We've seen several over history. It hasn't always been around. It will disappear, or if history hasn't even started in that sense until it does. And it's a process. It's still quite young. You could say that it was in modern capitalism, in the sense of becoming a dominant form. Didn't even begin really until the mid-19th century. It started probably in the 1750s, but as a dominant form globally, it still only began to become dominant from the mid-19th century. So it's Marx's time. He was before his time in understanding this process of the development of productive forces through the capitalist mode of production. But it also has a finite period of time to exist. And in a way, that graph shows it. It shows that its ability to continually reproduce more, exploit more value, exchange value out of workers is becoming more and more difficult, despite the tremendous expansion and its machines and development of technology and all the other methods and expansion across the world. Yes, if it can expand into China and it gets a better, higher rate of surplus value, gets more profit out of that, we can raise the rate of profit internationally. But as I've shown in the graph which showed the difference between the emerging economies and the older economies, mature economies, even there it is now beginning to struggle. There's still areas of exploitation to be made. But one of the features of the last 100 years, and particularly the last 50, is that what has collapsed in terms of the workforce is the agricultural workforce of the world. That has virtually been reduced by at least a third. Only in the neoliberal period it's fallen by a third. At the moment, the industrial working class globally has never been larger. It's also large as a percentage of the working population. Yes, the services sector, as it's called, people who don't work in industry, has always been the largest, actually. It's either been small proprietors, small businesses, various sorts of services provided, whether it was to the king or to society in general. The growth of an industrial working class is a phenomenon of capitalism in its dominant form, particularly from 1750 onwards, but particularly during the 19th century. And that process of an increasing industrialization of the human labour is still underway, not in Britain, not in Ireland, not in the mature economies, but internationally. So in that sense, you could say that the productive forces haven't been fully exhausted for capitalism. It's still got potential to get more value and surplus value out of the world working class, turning it into a working class from being an agricultural community. But you can see that it's becoming increasingly difficult to do so. Comrade raised, well, are we going to zero then? What's the logic of this? Yeah, well, actually we did it. Some of us tried to attempt, what would happen? When would it get to zero? Trouble is it's a bit of a statistical issue because it doesn't go in a straight line, and if you had a big recession and the rate of profit shot up like that, then where are you? Back there somewhere, and you've started again. But if you want to take the position just crudely, you get down to a position where there's no profit anymore. It's about 2065, if that's any use to you. But lots of things can happen between then, counteracting factors to change the process. But what the trend tells you is that it's increasingly difficult for for capitalism to operate as a mode of production that develops the productive forces because the profitability is there. And this is the point about the profitability which comrades have raised. Machines do create value. They create use value. They get more goods per person. That's what Marx called use values. So there's more use value, but the irony is they reduce the time that labour is expended in the process, and therefore they reduce the exchange value, or the value which is sold on the market within those use values. And as Comrade said about planned obsolescence, yes, capitalism dramatically expands the technology. This computer is already out of date by some way, I'd say. And the process is going very fast and faster and faster. So the use values are being moved on, but this is going to have to be written off as value, as profitable value to the capitalists. And therefore, actually the expansion and the acceleration of use values through technology is creating further problems for capitalism because it has to make a profit. It doesn't want to create use values, it wants to create value to be expropriated. That's the contradiction, and the planned obsolescence is part of that process, and the fact that it's becoming more and more difficult to provide that. They can centralise capital, as one comrade said. They can get rid of the bad bits, they can centralise it more. That's how we've developed a whole financial sector which dominates, sits on top like an octopus, or in the case of Goldman Sachs, like a giant vampire squid on the top of the economy, controlling it. And you can concentrate capital, you can bring it together to make it more effective and more efficient. But still it falls, is the phrase, still it falls. Over a period of time, yes, what we're talking about here, 140, 150 years. I know that maybe it's not going to bring about the end of capitalism in my lifetime. Who knows? But clearly the process is no longer one of a progressive process of increasing the productive forces without further and further more recurrent crises. If we go back here before 1869, which of course we don't have, we will probably see a generally rising rate of profit as more economies come into the process of capitalist domination. What we have really from that period, that long depression, is perhaps an indication of when the mature economies are beginning now to exhaust their ability to develop productive forces. Capitalism had to move imperialistically around the world to extract more surplus value and keep that rate of profit up. But it's becoming more and more difficult. And we're entering a periods of cycles. Comrade raised the question of longer cycles. I think there are longer cycles. I would argue that we have a cycle here where I like to call it, you have a recovery period, and then you have a period of crisis, or perhaps the best period, take the post-war period, you can see you have a golden age as a recovery period, then you have a crisis, and then you have perhaps another recovery, and then you get into a depression. You have 4 phases in my view. This is my view. This reduces the room to 1. And in that view, you get that's a whole Kondratiev cycle, if you like, of about 60 years. Kondratiev said that there was a big long-term cycle in capitalism like this. He saw it in prices of production. I think it could be more related to profitability and the global prices of production. I wrote about that in my book, and in the next one, nobody agrees with me. So there are, not only are we heading towards the end of capitalism as a system that takes anything forward, both in use values and certainly not in value as well, but we're also increasingly coming to a view where it is so exploited the world that it's created the conditions for destroying it, not just through what we used to think about nuclear war between Russia and America, but also in the climate and in nature. This is a big change. The evidence for scientists is overwhelming, despite the attempts of the skeptics to say otherwise. And it's created conditions where the strategists of capital sitting out in Brisbane now are worried. They recognise the need that something's got to be done. They are hoping that some new technology will come about to change that, whether it's renewables, Lockheed, the US aircraft manufacturer and military equipment manufacturer, claims that it's developed nuclear fusion batteries at last. We're still doubtful about that, but a nuclear fusion battery will be a dramatic technological transformation, as you know, because it would mean a huge amount of energy, completely safe with no nuclear waste, as opposed to nuclear fission. All kinds of technological changes the capitalists are hoping to develop and exploit. Of course, a planned economy would have done this ages ago, and we would have ruined the world in the process in the meantime. But even they are forced to consider doing that now, and hoping that's the answer. Because the answer of having a plan environmentally for the needs of the people, putting people before profit globally, and for putting the nature before profit globally, is not on the agenda, because profit has to be made. So there's a continual battle between destroying the world and providing profit for the energy companies and all the others. It's a battle which, or a worry, and a strategic think tank is going on indefinitely to try and bring that about. I would say that the strategists of capital sitting in Brisbane now, one comrade said about pride in capitalism, well, there doesn't seem to be too much pride coming out of that world meeting. The implication is that they're worried about the climate change could become a serious problem for the globe. They're worried that their depression is going to remain in the majority of countries around the world, and they're not going to get out of that, and therefore meet the demands of people who are beginning to get restive after 6 years of no wage increases and still not having a decent job. And jobs have been created mainly in countries like Britain, US and Ireland. Well, I mean, the biggest increase in employment in Britain, which has supposedly recovered. The purpose of this discussion, as far as I'm concerned, is to explain to you what period we're in. In my view, we're in a period of depression for world capitalism, not just US and some big countries in Europe, but globally, if you want, for the first time. And it's a depression that won't easily be overcome by capitalism, except by probably going through yet another slump that we'll have to take. Can you imagine, after we've just been through the Great Recession of 2008-9, and we've had no recovery since 2009 to 2014 for the majority of working people in most countries, to say in 2 or 3 years' time we have another one? Well, how will people react to that, and how will capitalism explain that?